The law of servitudes. Sounds really ominous, like it involves bondage or slavery or indentured servitude. It's that part of property law which started in England and then in America we inherited that involves promises that attach to land. These promises started in England during a time when there were a whole lot of invasions, and invading peoples would always come in with superior military technology like stirrups or metal weapons like swords, that the people, the peasants, simple people, would have no chance trying to defend themselves against. So the class of people who had the leisure and the wealth to own, train, own land, own horses, train in modern combat, which wasn't, to us that sophisticated, but it was. They were a warrior class, and they became bound to a promise literally attached to the land they owned, and that gave them the title of lord or count or baron. And the land that they owned, on that land, simple people lived and could cultivate that land for both the Lord and for themselves. And those promises were bound, or were binding on the lords, the warlords really, by conveyance directly from the crown. And they became bound to that promise to defend the peasants and their tenancy on the land in exchange for loyalty from those peasants, but it was part of a larger exchange of promises. And it came from the law of warranty that developed around the time of the French invasion of England, the Norman invasion. See, in 1066, William the Conqueror invaded England, and with his claim of ownership over the whole of England as a sovereign, he sought to reform property law. So he had all the land surveyed. That was actually written down in what the English later called the Domesday Book, because they really thought this was end of times. At least the lords did, not the peasants. But he had all of that land surveyed, and then he required everyone to whom he conveyed interests in the land directly to, he required them to observe certain promises. It was a two-way set of promises. You promise to be loyal to me when this place needs its warriors for defense, and I need to raise an army. Or you be bound to a promise to your people, the people who live on your land and who will need protection. You promise to defend them. And I'll give you this interest so that you can keep your homes or castles. But over time, future generations of landowning elite, they consistently hired the best attorneys to get them out of any promise that attached to the land, but which also attached to their titles as barons or lords or counts. So it became eventually really tough to enforce promises that attached to land at law. And today, any lawyer in America will tell you how difficult it is to run through the analysis of covenants that run with the land or their equivalent, equitable servitudes. And those last, they're called equitable servitudes because the courts at equity, when the courts of law in England refused to honor such promises, continued to enforce such promises in the name of equity. Today, most states in the U.S. use the older version of the law that retains all these strange technical rules to determine whether a promise actually attaches to land or is enforceable. And those rules include things like touch and concern, horizontal privity, vertical privity, intent to bind successors in interest, things that have little or no meaning outside the context of that arcane area of law. But in some jurisdictions like California, the law is beginning to follow a modern view, which is first set out in a guidebook that's published every so often based upon a survey of the law in America, and that's called, the most recent one's called the Third Restatement of Property Law. But that version says that if there's a promise and it purports to bind future property owners and it's been recorded for the world to know about in the county property records, and then the person trying to get out of the promise, or if that person knew or should have known about the promise when the property was purchased because they actually knew or because it was recorded in the county records at the time they purchased, then it's just sensible to hold them to the promise unless it violates some kind of public policy. So in jurisdictions that follow this modern rule, which is really only California, something called a transfer fee covenant or something similar might be used to flip the real estate development model on its head for the people and for environmental improvement. How so? Well, historically in America, covenants that run with the land, they've been used privately to enforce pretty racist limitations on upon whom individual property owners might be able to sell their interest. This was meant during a time of pervasive racism, and segregation seemed to be challenged to enforce segregation at the level of property law privately. So you might, for example, have the following recorded in the public record against title to all the single-family parcels in a development or a condominium. Quote, said property is hereby restricted to the use and occupancy for the term of 50 years from this date, so that hereafter no part of said property or any portion thereof shall be for said term of 50 years occupied by any person not of the Caucasian race, it being intended hereby to restrict the use of said property for said period of time against the occupancy as owners or tenants of any portion of said property for resident or other purpose by people of the Negro or Mongolian race. And these restrictive covenants excluded Jews, Asians, African Americans, and Hispanics from living in the wealthiest neighborhoods in parts of America, including Chicago, which I think that covenant comes from. I'm not sure. But the same concept, a covenant that runs with the land, could be used to impose upon real estate developers a requirement that the current tenant, or that all tenants, a requirement that current tenants, if it's an inner city community, never get exploited, or that racial and social justice principles clearly set forth in the instrument bind the developer and any successors in interest to the property. So the developer can't just transfer title to the land to someone else. Say he's bound by contract but not by property law, and the other, now property owner, can violate that promise. With covenants that run with the land, you can bind any successor in interest to the developer. They wouldn't be able to get out of the restriction from exploitation, or the restriction to use the property for a specific purpose. You could also use transfer fee right covenants to have a payment to a fund of a percentage of the sales price in the future, including when future property owners sell the property, have those payments go to a fund, and that fund can be used to securitize the finance of the transformation of the current tenants' lives and the community in poor communities with the proceeds of such a securitization, selling an interest in that fund in the secondary market. And those tenants who will occupy the neighborhood after it's been transformed, if they want, they will be those upper middle class professionals. And these tools, they come from really terrible moments in history, from really clever ways the rich have avoided responsibilities or broken promises, but now we can use them to finance our own transformation in a way that attracts initial investment in our dreams.